Hello everybody, welcome to Friday's episode of the Rugby Bunker. A little bit different this week because Charlie and I did the podcast on Monday when we were at Penny Hill Park for England's squad announcement ahead of the autumn. Well, I say squad announcement ahead of the autumn, their mini camp announcement at the start of their 3 days worth of access, and we had lots of stories there from Steve Borthwick's comments on Tom Willis and Noah Kaluri and Emma Corleone as well. So I thoroughly recommend checking that episode out. But this one's going to be a little bit different. So I will be flying solo either side of a conversation with Ben Cisneros, who is a sports lawyer, specializes in sports law. The reason I wanted to speak to Ben this week was kind of in relation to the Willis stuff and based on some comments that a lot of you posted on our TikTok page reacting to the Willis video about me saying why the Willis decision meant that, you know, quite rightly, he wasn't going to be selected for England anymore based on the policy. And a few of you sort of pushing back on the policy itself. And that kind of got me thinking about this policy has been in place now for 13 years, I think. So technically, if you were say you were 20 years old when the policy came into effect and you were just starting out in your professional career, by now you could have gone through your whole career with this overseas selection policy in place, essentially preventing you from playing for England if you wanted to go abroad. And I think occasionally we forget to kind of step back and look at these policies as a whole and what they mean and why they're in place. And the Willis move to Bordeaux-Bègles kind of ending his international career, for now at least, just when it seemed as though he was about to get on a bit of a run with England, has, I think, made some people reassess it. So I'm going to get into that with Ben, and then afterwards I'll chat a little bit about some news stories, preview the Prem games, and see you in a bit. Right, delighted to be joined on the Rugby Bunker by Ben Cisneros. If I just maybe ask you first of all, just give us a bit of a background on yourself.
Absolutely, thanks very much for having me on. So I'm an associate at Morgan Sports Law, which is a boutique law firm specializing in resolving sports disputes, primarily for athletes. I also run a blog called Rugby in the Law, and that area is very much my focus within our practice.
So with something like this topic, we're so used to players moving overseas, and I think because the policy has now been in place for so long, dating back to 2012, we sort of just accept that when a player moves to France, that is it, and we know what that means for their international career. I wondered, to touch on the article that you wrote last year, and what I'm most interested in hearing about is, do you think that policy would hold up legally if a case came forward?
Well, it's not a straightforward answer, I don't think. The best way of probably putting it is that I think it could be open to challenge. I wouldn't necessarily want to put my neck on the line and say which way it would go, but I certainly think there are reasons to doubt its legality, primarily because it restricts players' ability to work wherever they like. There are probably two aspects to it that are worth explaining. The first is the obvious one, that if you're a player who decides you want to go and play for a club overseas, then you're not going to be considered for England selection. So you're deprived of the opportunity to play for England and get the resulting benefits from that, which financially is quite significant. The other impact is that by operating this policy, the RFU is encouraging players to stay in England, and therefore is discouraging them from going elsewhere, which effectively helps the Premiership clubs get those players under contract. It sort of narrows the market for their services, which inevitably will have an impact on their negotiating power and thus their earning potential within that league. So I think those are the two main ways in which this policy limits players, and those effects could be categorized as either a restraint of trade or a violation of competition law. And those things can give rise to legal consequences. They can result in the policies being found invalid, unlawful, potentially giving rise to damages claims, etc. And therefore, I do think there are grounds for raising this question. I think it's a good question for you to be asking. As I said, though, it's not necessarily straightforward. There could be questions about whether such limitations are justifiable. The RFU typically point to the suggestion that this helps the national team by giving the coaches greater access to the England players. They also say pretty openly, actually, that this helps the Premiership, which is, of course, the point I was making earlier. It sort of ensures the England players go there. And, of course, that limits the market open to players, but it also means that the Premiership has this access to top English talent, which I suppose the RFU would say is good for the English game. It's good for the grassroots because people can see their heroes locally and as a pathway straight to the England team through the local, or the domestic sides. So those would be the reasons the RFU would put forward. And the question is whether they would be sufficient to justify any prima facie violation of trade law or competition law. I think if a competition law violation was found to exist, it could be quite difficult for those reasons to amount to justifications. But the challenge for the RFU is really that those reasons go a lot further than the World Rugby regulations, for example. And I mean, this is one of the issues for the RFU. The World Rugby regulations set out periods of time during which players have to be released to their countries, including for training. But the RFU's policy goes a lot further than that. So on one hand, the players will say, well, hang on a minute, the World Rugby regulations set out what's sort of necessary and reasonable to allow national teams to have success. Why do we need to have this policy allowing even greater access to players? And in fact, famously, South Africa, who won the World Cup the last two editions, have gone about their business relying really only on World Rugby's release periods. They've not implemented a similar policy to the RFU. They've not had greater access to their players than everybody else. So it might be quite challenging for the RFU to say, we need this in order to allow the national team to thrive. And the other aspects of World Rugby's regulations that I would point to is that in the eligibility regulations themselves, the preamble explains that high quality international rugby is in the best interest of the sport at all levels. The selection of the best players for international rugby also represents the fairest selection system, as it's based on playing merit. So this idea of selecting your best players is actually baked into World Rugby's rules. So those are just a couple of ways in which I think it could be challenging to justify this policy, but it wouldn't be a straightforward challenge if one were to be brought. And the other thing to throw into the mix, of course, is that the players may well have sat down with the RFU and negotiated this as part of their overall package with England. We don't know exactly. The hybrid contracts have now been put in place, which I think was seen as sort of a bit of an antidote to this rule, in the sense that although players realize they might be able to earn more money elsewhere, the RFU have stepped in and said, well, if you're within our sort of top group of players, we'll top up your Premiership salary. So I think that may have been part of a bit of a negotiation around this. So it might be that it's not really anything the players want to fight about, or even could fight about if they've come to that sort of agreement. It's an interesting topic, and as you can probably tell, I can talk about it for hours.
No, I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I think that was one of the big questions that I had, was how exactly, because it's very well saying that there is a case for a legal challenge here, or that it's a possibility, but actually getting a player sort of in the middle of their career to kind of put the time aside and put in the dedication and to go through the legal costs of presenting the case. I think that's partly what interests me, because I'm struggling to imagine, even if there was a chance that the case might work, and from the way you've laid it out, who knows, but there's a possibility. But actually finding a player who would be willing to stand up and say, I want to fight this legally, That's a fascinating proposition, isn't it? Because like you're suggesting, it would be very difficult for a player to do on his own. It would almost require a whole group of players based overseas to sort of band together, is the impression that I'm getting.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right to point out that it would be a big risk for one player to take on by themselves. I mean, we have seen in other sports these types of challenges being brought, and the player is something of a martyr for their cause. You think of players like Jean-Marc Bosman, Peckstein, the skater, Diarra, the recent football player. These names have become synonymous with the cases and perhaps dominate that athlete's legacy more than their sporting achievements. I think you're also right to point out that by players grouping together, that might be one way of sort of reducing the individual exposure. And it's foreseeable that the whole group of England players, the whole squad could group together and present a challenge to the RFU on it. It wouldn't necessarily have to be limited to players who are abroad, because as I said, the impact is also indirectly on players playing over here, because you're restricting the potential market that they can offer their services to, which likely results in a suppression of their wages here. So I think that the potential pool of claimants, if you want to put it that way, might be even broader than just those who are currently overseas.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we hear from players all the time saying how they have considered opportunities abroad and have had to make the decision not to go because they don't want to give up their England careers. I think it's a good point about South Africa and their kind of player release limitations and how actually that hasn't sort of affected them on the field. We've seen other countries try policies with a certain number of caps, such as Giteau's law with Australia and Gatland's law with Wales, and the 30 cap rule, which seems to be kind of being tweaked and manipulated with each passing year in terms of who is eligible and who is not, and having to get approval. I think it might be Rhys Carrier, the Saracens prop this time, who is under the cap limit, but his participation in the Wales squad has been approved by the board of players or something like that. So we are seeing these policies kind of mishmashed. Is it just easier in a way, I wonder, to have a kind of as close to what we have now, which is a black and white situation of if you go, then that's it, that you're not playing? Or is there a merit, I guess, to these hybrid policies that we've seen over the years?
I think if you're asking me from a legal perspective, I think there's probably merit in these hybrid policies, because they're less restrictive, right? They give more opportunity for players to be selected to explore options abroad, etc. So I would say, if I was advising from a legal perspective, I'd say there's definitely merit in considering that. I also think, though, if you adopt that sort of policy, you then need to stick to it. Otherwise, you might have other sorts of challenges brought against you because, well, you're making exceptions for one player but not others. Why is that? And that could be another sort of quite messy legal situation. So, I think certainly that the blanket rule, which we have at the moment, is probably more challengeable. That tends to be the way that, that tends to be the case in many competition type cases that are brought, is where there's a blanket rule that someone is absolutely not to whatever the circumstance is. Then that's more challengeable than if you have a sort of nuanced rule, because these nuanced rules can perhaps more easily be argued as being proportionate. They balance both parties' interests, etc., and come to a bit of a compromise. So I think that sort of rule might be better from that perspective. You could also imagine a situation in which the RFU could adopt a policy whereby they will select a certain number of players who are based abroad but no more. They'll sort of have a maximum number they might pick. I can see that being slightly more readily justifiable. Yeah, there's various ways to look at it, but it's interesting.
Just finally, Ben, before I let you go, and I appreciate that this has just popped in my head, so I haven't briefed you on it, but there was, this week we spoke to Steve Borthwick on Monday about Tom Willis, and Willis back in August signed one of the enhanced elite player squad contracts, which we've discussed, the hybrid contracts, which are worth 160,000 for the season, and what those give the RFU in return is kind of enhanced medical access to players and just generally speaking, better management of them throughout an international season so that they can have a say with clubs on how players are managed. We saw this a lot last season with Manny Faye-Reboso and an injury that he had. Obviously now Willis is going to France, and so at the end of the season, and so he's not being selected, so he's effectively getting this contract but without having to play for England or being selected by England. From what we've heard so far, there doesn't seem to be any sort of break clause in the deal where even though Willis has been given one of these contracts, he's now not going to be playing because he's going overseas. I wondered if it does turn out that's the case, and that's the latest that we've heard, does it surprise you that there might not be a clause in there along those lines? And how quickly do you think they will be writing one in ahead of the next wave of enhanced CPS deals before next season?
Yeah, it's a good point. I suppose a little bit of a surprise there's not that sort of clause in there. But I suppose at the moment he remains eligible for selection. It's simply that Steve Borthwick doesn't want to select him because he's going to be ineligible next season, or possibly, as he signed a 2-year deal, I think maybe. So he's not going to be around for a couple of years, but he doesn't want to select him now simply because he wants to develop other players in that position. I can also see how the players would push back on that and say, well, that's your choice. I'm here, I'm available, I want to play. You should just pick your best available squads. Again, we sort of hark back to that World Rugby regulation that says, international rugby should be about the best against the best. And so I think players will probably push back pretty hard on that. Certainly, I'm sure he would jump at the opportunity to play for England while he still can.
Yeah, for sure. It just intrigued me on Monday that there was nothing in place, but you're right. I suppose he is technically still eligible, and it feels likely that will be clarified in the next wave of contracts next year, I would imagine.
Quite possibly. The players will have a say in that as well. So it all goes into the melting pot, I imagine.
That's very true. That's very true. Oh, Ben, listen, thank you for your time. It's a tricky subject, but I feel that you've explained that very well and certainly made it easier for me to understand. So appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, hopefully you found that interesting, as you could probably tell I did. Fascinating trying to kind of unpack the different strands of this story. Let's get into this week's Prem games. So first up tonight is Northampton against Saracens. I just want to, rather than kind of go through all the team news and give a prediction, you'll find the predictions by the time this goes out on the Off-Field Review on Substack, which is where I post them every Friday lunchtime. But just some kind of key stats which interested me. These stats come through Stuart Farmer, who supplies them to the PREM Rugby website. And so I've just sort of picked out some little bits of information that kind of interest me. So Northampton against Saracens, Saints just don't lose at home. I think that's the bottom line. They've only lost there once in the league in 2025. So while Saracens are coming into this in pretty good form, I think they just had that one defeat away a couple of weeks ago at Harlequins in the derby, but otherwise I think they've looked very impressive. They actually do not have a brilliant record at Franklin's Gardens either. I think they've lost their last 5 in all competitions. Fascinated to see if Northampton can build off that momentum from the win at Newcastle last week, and to see if they've learned anything from the way Harlequins sort of contained Saracens through their kicking game in that game at the Stoop a couple of weeks ago, or to see whether Saracens can build off these attacking displays that we've seen at home in these massive wins over Bristol and Sale and take that on the road. I think we probably lose track actually, and this shows up more when you go through the preview packages and the stats, actually how many teams struggle to string together away wins or put in away performances. And the fact that Saracens' record at the Cinch Stadium at Franklin's Gardens to give it its full title isn't great. That interests me, but it's a belting game to kick off the weekend. The injuries at Gloucester are just insane. It feels like George Skivington is just losing players, 2 or 3 players every single game, which is why this is being recorded before their team comes out. But I'm fascinated to see who they actually have available. And I kind of think that we're at a point where we need to completely reassess what Gloucester are going to be able to achieve this season, because if they have these many key players sidelined and they're losing, then it becomes incredibly tricky to predict that they're going to finish in the top 4, as I know I did at the start of pre-season. I did not see this wave of injuries hitting them and kind of disrupting everything. But if they do lose, against Exeter, and there's every chance 5 losses in a row would be their worst run since January last year. And the omens aren't great. They don't win away that often. They have only won Sandy Park. I think the last time they won there was 2015. So they're winless there in their last 10 games. And also, just in general, they don't win away that often. I think they've only won 1 of their last 7, which was at Newcastle back in May. So you factor all that in, combined with how well Exeter have started the season, I think that's probably been the most pleasant surprise so far, is seeing how well Exeter have played, how well they've got this attack going. You've got Manny Favour-Bosa leading the league in clean breaks with 12 coming into this game, which is fantastic for Steve Borthwick in England, looking to kind of get the best out of him and to see him back fit and firing this summer. You're probably hoping to have that tandem of Favour-Bosa and Tommy Freeman on the wings. Listen, if Gloucester can go there, beating up Gloucester can go to Exeter and pick up a result, that's going to be tricky. And I think making Sandy Park a horrible place to go again is exactly what Exeter want. Like we saw it when Harlequins went there recently. If they can turn that into a nasty place to go, Rob Baxter will be delighted. Speaking of Harlequins, absolutely not a shock to see that Will Evans leads the league in turnovers with 8 and also with tackles on 78 so far. I think this game against Newcastle, after the way Harlequins performed at Exeter, you would expect a bit of a backlash. And I think for Newcastle, even though there were signs that they improved, I think, against Southampton, their away form and their away record, it just doesn't give you any confidence to feel like you can back them in this situation. I mean, now I've said this, they will obviously go there and win, but they haven't won away in the Premiership since November 2022 at Gloucester, and they haven't beaten Harlequins at all since February 2021. So forms against them, I think Harlequins kind of need to lay down a marker, going from that very impressive controlled win over Saracens to then getting blown out at Sandy Park is fairly concerning. So this is their chance to kind of put that right. And I think Newcastle's the perfect opponent to get at this time, given their away form. Bath against Bristol should be spicy. There's a little bit of history on the line here for Bath, who are going for 11 home wins in a row. They haven't done that since 2014. The last time they actually lost to the Rec was to Bristol last October, when Bristol kind of went to the Rec with this all-court thrilling style of rugby and stunned everybody when people weren't expecting much from Bristol last season. So that's interesting. I think also, if you're Bristol, do you want to face Bath with Bath coming off a loss? Probably not. I don't think that's exactly the perfect time. I feel like Bath, even though they beat Bristol in the semi-final last season to get to the final, I think they will still have the memory of last season's game at the Rec probably in the back of their minds. And good news for Bristol, getting Ellis Genge back. I wonder if we might see a bit of Ellis Genge against Will Stewart, which would be quite a fun scrummaging kind of preview ahead of the autumn. But we'll soon find out. And that leaves on Sunday Leicester against Saracens. Coming off that win against Bath, I hope and wonder if that is going to be the launch pad for their era under Jeff Parling. You could sort of see the belief that they have. Sale have got a fairly decent record at Mattioli Woods, Welford Road. I think they've won 4 out of their last 7 there. But Leicester actually at home have been very tough to beat. They are unbeaten at home now, dating back to March when they last played Saracens at the back end of March. I think Sale need this. I think the problem we currently have with Sale, and I spoke with George Ford earlier this week for an interview that's out in the Observer on Sunday about why, well, actually he brought it up himself about Sale's attack, and he just said our breakdown work hasn't been good enough in terms of clearing out and generating quick ball, and that's why you haven't seen the best of our attack yet. I don't know if a Leicester back row of Ollie Cracknell and Ilioni and Tommy Raphael, that's not kind of a back row that you win quick ball against, especially the way that Raphael and Cracknell can win turnovers, and Ilioni as well. So it's a tricky game for Sale. I think they need an away win, a big away win, to validate what we thought in pre-season, that they are potential finalists and that they could be the team that face Bath when it comes down to it at Allianz Stadium. It's a fascinating game on Sunday. It's quite a good slate of games in general. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight into what we're thinking about going into it. Okay, a couple of news things just to touch on before we finish off. Yesterday being Thursday, confirmed that Byron McGuigan will join the England coaching staff during the autumn. He's basically going to work on the contact skills area with Andrew Strawbridge. Andrew Strawbridge is the New Zealand assistant coach who is going to head back to New Zealand, I think, following these internationals has been a good part of that setup. So McGuigan comes in on like a job share basis with Sale. After he did the defence in Argentina over the summer, Lee Blackett did the attack in Argentina over the summer and has now joined the setup. Basically, if you want to keep your coaches long term, maybe don't loan them to England for a brief spell, because there's every chance that they may end up joining the national setup full time. McGuigan, fascinating because it's been quite a rapid ascent up the coaching ranks in terms of, it feels like he was literally playing like last week. McGuigan's done a very decent job at Sale since taking over from Jamie Langley in November last year. Breakdown work is such a key part of what England are looking for, because there's such a focus for them on quick ruck ball, on playing with speed. And if your breakdown work is off and you're unable to generate that quick ball, that's when your attack starts to stumble a little bit. So McGuigan comes in. Other bit of news from yesterday is that Luke Cowan-Dickie is free to play after his 20-minute red card was overturned for what was deemed to be a head-on-head tackle against Saracens. We've spoken so much about Tom Willis in the last week, but actually this is an instance of Tom Willis helping England, because in Cowan-Dickie's disciplinary hearing, Willis, who was the player who received the alleged high tackle from Cowan-Dickie, gave a testimony which basically said, look, he didn't hit me on the head. It wasn't head-on-head. It was shoulder-on-shoulder. I didn't feel anything. I was happy to play on. This created an interesting situation where the RFU officials and citing commissioner had deemed that there was a head-on-head contact, which is why there was a disciplinary hearing in the first place. And then on the other hand, you had both Cowan-Dickie and Willis both saying that actually it wasn't a high tackle and that Cowan-Dickie shouldn't be punished for it. And that left the independent disciplinary panel in quite an interesting position, where they had to kind of weigh up the footage that they were seeing versus the testimony of the players. Ultimately, Cowan-Dickie's free to play. I think that's huge for England, because it frees them up now to go into the autumn with Cowan-Dickie as their starter, and then potentially Jamie George or Theo Dan off the bench. I think I would go with Jamie George to close out test matches, but Cowan-Dickie certainly would have been Steve Borthwick's preference, I imagined, to start those tests. So that's a real boost for England. And just a final thought on this 9-week ban for the South Africa hooker Jan-Hendrik Wessels, in case you've missed this. So in a Bulls against Connacht game last week, early in the first half, Connacht's Josh Murphy was sent off for striking Wessels after he basically lashed out at him at the bottom of a ruck. And the reason Murphy claimed that he lashed out was because he had been grabbed in the groin area, let's say, by Wessels, and that led to him striking him. I mean, the evidence immediately looking at the broadcast footage isn't conclusive, which has sort of led to a bit of a debate about what actually happened. And I know that a lot of people in South Africa are very upset. 2 points that I want to make, and I posted these on Twitter yesterday, so this isn't fresh stuff if you follow those. But I think firstly, this Wessels ban of 9 matches, which is pretty severe, but I think Joe Marler got the same when he did something similar to Alan Jones a few years ago. It gives the Springboks brilliant kind of bulletin board motivational material going into the autumn. This idea that the authorities are against them, because right now, recording this as of Friday morning, there's limited evidence out there in the public domain which shows why Wessels has been banned for this reason. Now, there's normally more broadcast angles and audio out there for disciplinary panels to review in cases like this than sometimes you see on TV. I'm wondering if that's going to be the case with this incident, because the Hawkeye system, apparently, which is used for all of the camera angles, was allegedly affected by the Amazon Web Services outage during the game. So the television match official, Holly Davison, didn't have access to all of the angles at the time. I don't know if you still get access to all of those angles when you're in the disciplinary process, if they still have that footage kind of recorded remotely and it's still accessible. You would certainly hope so, because I am struggling, and maybe this is me naively trusting in the system too much. I am struggling to imagine that a disciplinary panel would be banning a player initially for 12 weeks, like Wessels, and then reducing it to 9 because of the usual tropes that we're used to from disciplinary hearing, like good conduct and all of that stuff. I am struggling to imagine that a disciplinary panel would be banning him for 9 games based on the footage that we have seen, because it's not conclusive, and based solely on the testimony of Murphy. Now, why would Murphy lie? You might argue, and I think that's a very valid point. I don't know Josh Murphy at all. I don't really know Wessels at all either in terms of their characters. But something has clearly happened for Murphy to react that way. But at the same time, right now, we haven't seen enough evidence. I wait eagerly to read the full disciplinary judgment when it comes out about how the panel got to this point, what kind of testimony they had, what angles they had that we may not have seen, whether Wessels even pleaded guilty. That hasn't been made apparent from the URC statement confirming the 9 games that he's banned for. I can see why South Africans are frustrated by this. I think personally, we're very used to in the English game or with PREM Rugby that, you know, a player gets banned and within 24 hours, 48 hours, there's normally a full judgment available on the RFU disciplinary website. So Jan-Hendrik this week is a great example. We were able to kind of read that judgment maybe a day after the decision came down that his red card had been rescinded. I think transparency with this Wessels decision is going to be key, because otherwise it's going to feed this idea in South Africa that the authorities are against them, which, if I'm really cynical, I imagine Rassie Erasmus is thinking, we don't want injustice, but actually this is something that we can use to motivate us going into the autumn. When you're a side as successful as South Africa are right now, back-to-back World Cups, a Lions series, a series against New Zealand for the first time in forever, back-to-back Rugby Championships, this kind of incident, cynically, and South Africans might not like this, gives you such easy bulletin board material to then take into these games. The world is against us. This is how we bind together. This is how we win games. We're going to show them. So I'm fascinated to see how it plays out. And it's been interesting to see some of the spicier replies on my Twitter feed trying to point it out as a neutral what I make of the process. But that's enough of me rambling. Lots to unpack there. Thank you again for watching. Please consider a like and a subscribe, and to follow us on TikTok and wherever you like to get your rugby content. Enjoy the weekend. Next week it gets busy with the autumn tests. I think we're just about emotionally and mentally ready, but yeah, looking forward to it. Thanks very much.